How can you work in having a good relationship with yourself?
Work hard at it and we focus on it, that we can make it happen.
People who have accomplished great things did accomplish great things because they didn't give up.
Don't view it as a mission impossible. View everything as a mission possible.
Today, we have the amazing honor to have as a guest one of the most respected journalists in the United States. He is an American television investigative journalist, conspiracy theorist, news anchor, and talk radio host. He has received numerous important awards such as Peabody, Mark Twain, Edgar Murrow, and Emmy Awards due to his outstanding work. He is best known to broke Bob Lazar's story of what goes on at Area 51 since 1989. He was recognized as well by the United Press International as the best individual achievement by a journalist. Thanks to his special reporting on Bob Lazar, he's George Knapp. Welcome, and thank you so much again for accepting this invitation.
I'm glad to be here. Can't wait to have this conversation.
You have worked for several decades on investigating UFO cases, paranormal activities related to life on other planets, unidentified flying objects, conspiracy theory, and other interesting and mysterious cases. What is your main purpose about doing this investigation? What do you want the world to know?
Well, when I started, I think the dominant paradigm at the time, the thought of UFOs is that these are extraterrestrials coming from other planets to visit Earth. Most people in my line of work, journalists, did not take it very seriously. They dismissed it. They made fun of it and made fun of the people who studied the issues. I knew very little about it until about 1987. And a guy named John Lear walked into our TV station. John Lear was the son of the guy who created the Lear jet. He had run for public office. He had flown for the CIA. He was an accomplished pilot, and he had helped our TV station break an important story about something that was flying out in the skies of the Nevada desert that was invisible to radar. Well, it turned out that that plane was the stealth fighter. And because he helped us break that story, he had some credibility. And he came into the TV station with a stack of documents, UFO documents, that he dropped on the desk of my boss. And he said, Ned, this is the biggest story of all time. You got to take a look at this. It's a cover-up, a global cover-up, and it'll be the biggest story in your career. Ned looked at the documentation for a minute and pushed it away and said, this can't be true because I would already know about it if it were true. As John is about to leave the station, I said, hey, let me take a look at that stuff. And I started going through it. He left the pile of documentation. These are documents squeezed out of the US government through the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. I knew very little about it. I put him on a TV show that I hosted at the time, a half-hour talk show that would air in the morning that no one would ever watch. It would be city councilman, county commissioner, something like that. But I put him on and let him do his thing. And he spews out this incredible conspiracy theory about UFOs and the cover-up and aliens are abducting humans. I didn't know what to make of it, but the phone started ringing. The audience was intrigued. I mean, I wouldn't get 5 calls a week normally for this program, but I was getting dozens of calls. Hey, is that guy for real? So I had him on again some months later, and the response was even bigger. And I realized that this issue touches the pulse of the public in a way that I did not understand. So I started reading about UFOs. And the first thing I thought was, this topic is a mess. It's a total mess. People are always fighting each other. Everybody attacks everybody else. There are a lot of hoaxers and people who make stuff up. There's a lot of people who are mentally unbalanced who are involved in this. Yeah. There are profiteers who make things up in order to make money. And I thought, you know what it needs is a good reporter, and give me 6 weeks, 6 months, I'll have this whole thing figured out. Well, you know, obviously I was kind of cocky back then, and I was completely mistaken, because here it is more than 35 years later, and I know a lot more, but I understand even less, because the issue is way more complicated. It isn't just aliens visiting our planet. Exactly. It's something else entirely. And it's been with humanity throughout human history. And I thought, after I'd spent some time on it, this would be the biggest story in history, period. Wow, if it turns out to be true, non-human intelligence interacting with us, it changes everything. So, you know, I got hooked on the subject, and I've been pursuing it ever since.
And for many years, as you say, you have traveled the world investigating and researching thousands of extreme UFO cases. From all of the discovery you had made, which one has been the most fascinating and unbelievable discovery? Was it this one or which one has been?
Well, Bob Lazar's story certainly opened my eyes to government involvement and all the skullduggery and intrigue that takes place in there. And, it's hard for people who don't understand the subject to believe it, but there is a lot of manipulation by our government and absolute lying. The US government, I think some Latin American governments have been way more open about the topic than the Americans have, but a lot of the world takes their lead from the US. So the US has a lot of influence with other militaries around the world. And it is, in fact, the militaries who are able to collect this information because they have radar, they have sensors everywhere, they have pilots, they have global reach. So, of course, they're in a position to have the best information, and they have covered it up. Our government has flat out lied to the American public and to the world for all these years. So I think in the beginning, it was the Lazar story. And at the time, he believed, and I believed him, that it was extraterrestrials coming to our planet, that we had somehow acquired alien technology, and that out in the Nevada desert, they were taking it apart to reverse engineer and figure out how it worked. It wasn't something we were building. We were taking it apart to figure out how it worked and to try to duplicate it. Then, because of that series with Bob Lazar, I got to meet two of the most important people in the history of the subject. One is Robert Bigelow, a billionaire Las Vegas businessman who saw that series, wanted to meet Lazar, wanted to meet me, wanted to help. And as a result of that series, it's instigated his interest in the topic. He has now spent more money investigating UFOs and related mysteries than any person in the history of the world. Wow. The other person who contacted me then, that I was in contact with as a result of the Lazar thing, was US Senator Harry Reid. Harry Reid was in his first term of the US Senate in 1989. He was the first person that I told outside of our newsroom about Lazar, Area 51, UFO, the UFO cover-up. So I started meeting with him, and I told him, I don't think this is crazy. And he didn't kick me out of his car. He said, yeah, I'm interested in that. Keep me informed. So that relationship that started way back there in '89, and with Harry Reid and Bob Bigelow, changed everything for this topic, because those two men later got together to create the biggest UFO study program ever launched by the US government. In the meantime, though, Bob Bigelow in 1996 bought a place called Skinwalker Ranch. It's in northeastern Utah, and for several decades, that part of Utah had been a hotbed of UFO activity. People who lived there, you couldn't find hardly anyone who hadn't seen one. And there were also dramatic paranormal events that had happened that had not been reported, just the UFO stuff. So Bigelow hears about this ranch. He goes up to meet the ranch owner, who starts telling him about these UFOs that have been buzzing the property for a long period of time, as well as other bizarre events. Bigelow bought the ranch. He sent a team of scientists up there. They put cameras, sensors, equipment all over the ranch, and they started a study. It was kept secret for several years. I was allowed to know because of my friendship with Bigelow, but the reports that were coming in were so far beyond just UFOs. I mean, there were UFOs that were seen. There were orbs of different shapes and sizes, but that's just the icing on the cake. They started having other bizarre activity, creatures, Bigfoot. The people who lived there were tortured by this phenomena. They'd wake up at night, they'd hear heavy footsteps in their house. They'd wake up and look, and there's these big dark figures standing at the foot of their bed. Wow. There was poltergeist type activity. Things would move around on their own. The wife, for example, she was a vice president of a bank. Her husband was a college-educated expert in artificial insemination of cattle. I mean, he knew what he was doing. Their kids were both straight A students, but this phenomena, whatever it was, really messed them up. The wife would take a shower in the morning. She'd lock the door. She puts a towel and a hairbrush on the cabinet, gets in the shower, comes back out. On one of these occasions, the door's still locked. The hairbrush and the towel are gone. Now, who got into it's just trickster type activity. They found the hairbrush later in the freezer. The husband is out in the orchard, not the orchard, but on the pasture. He's using a heavy piece of equipment. It's called a post hole digger to dig holes to put fencing in. He stops for a second. He wipes his brow, takes a sip of water, looks around. This thing is gone. and they found it later 70 feet up in a tree, in a cottonwood tree. Those kind of things happened all the time. The family felt that they were being watched all the time. And then strange things would happen to their animals. Their cattle started being carved up. Their cats were mutilated. They had one calf it was a bright Sunday morning. The calf had just been tagged. Its ear had been tagged because it was a newborn. It was 50 yards from the house where they live. The wife and the husband are out there. It's a quiet day out in the country. They tag this calf with its mom, then they move on across the pasture. Something comes in and carves up this calf in complete silence. So it's like a half an hour later, they look back and the mother cow is running around in a circle, dragging its leg. Its eyes are bulging out. It's clearly upset. It's in panic. They run over there, and there's this calf, or what's left of it. It had been completely stripped of flesh. There's nothing left but bone and hide. One of the femur bones had been ripped out and thrown over the side. There is no blood on the ground. There's no blood in the calf. Something had come in and taken 75 pounds of meat off this calf in complete silence while they were there, just 100 yards away. That was one of the maybe the most dramatic incident of cattle mutilations, but they had a bunch of them. Their neighbors had the same thing. So something was clearly going on at Skinwalker that went way beyond UFOs. And the NIDS team, Bigelow's team, went in there. They were there for 7 years. They had dramatic experiences. They encountered some kind of intelligence that really tried to scare them. I was learning about this, but I couldn't tell anybody about it. And finally, I bugged Bob Bigelow in 2002. I said, hey, let me report on this now, because the activity itself had decreased so much that his team had very little to do anymore. It was as if the Skinwalker didn't want to be chased anymore. So they let me publish a story about it, and then it went all over the world. And that case, as complicated as it is, really changed my view about what this intelligence is. It suggests that it might be extraterrestrial, but it is way more complicated than that. It seems to live here. It seems to be among us, maybe crypto-terrestrial, ultra-terrestrial, something that has been here as long as humans have, and that interacts with us on a regular basis. I have heard people say, we're ready to know the truth. We can handle the truth. Depends on what the truth is, because
it depends, exactly. And I suppose you get like hundreds of photos of UFO experiment, all sorts of things constantly. How can you define something is real or fake? What are the key factors for you you need to have in order to work on a case?
It's important for me as a journalist to not try to pretend to be an expert on photo or video analysis. So I have other people that do that kind of thing. I get as you mentioned, every day I get people to send me stuff, and you can almost tell. I mean, after a while, you can tell some of it, what the explanations are. I see a lot of disc-shaped photographs, for example, that turn out to be birds. And to try to gently tell somebody, hey, your UFO photo is a bird, they don't like it. They don't like it at all. So you have to be very gentle about it. I have a basic screening process. I can tell if something is worth investigating further or not. And then I turn it over to experts, people that I work with who are photo analysts and photographers who can tell the difference between a light reflection and something that's real. And then I also have access to Bigelow and some of his team who have really advanced equipment where they can analyze things. So I rely on experts to tell me whether something is real or not. I also rely on the US government because I've been at this so long. I've developed a number of sources whom I trust, who have shared with me information that I've made public over the years, things that are recorded by pilots, Navy pilots, for example, the kinds of images that the world has seen in the last couple of years, Tic Tac and Gimbal and Go Fast and things like that. There are a lot more of those still to come.
And throughout your career, in your opinion, what is the best UAP unidentified aerial phenomena video out there right now?
I think the Tic Tac case is the most important UFO case of all time, more important than Roswell because it is so well documented. First, you have the pilot who was the first to interact with it, David Fravor. He's the commander of the Black Aces, absolutely impeccable reputation. He's the best of the best. This sensor equipment in those planes and on the ships, the Princeton and the USS Nimitz, are the best in the world. And they confirmed these things have been flying around for a couple of weeks. before they scrambled any jets to go after it. We know that Dave Fravor and then other pilots or aviators saw this thing. The incredible maneuvers that it made is documented on a variety of different sensors. That information was kept under wraps by the U.S. military for a long time until Bigelow and his team, when they created this new organization called OSAP. OSAP is a program that was created. It started in 2008. Bigelow got a contract from the DIA, that's the Defense Intelligence Agency, to study UFOs. And that became the biggest UFO study ever by our government. I mean, Project Blue Book, which we all know about, that had maybe 3 to 5 employees. Bigelow's organization had 50 full-time employees investigating UFOs. They created the largest UFO database in the world, 200,000 cases, including many cases from Brazil, all over Mexico and Latin America. All those cases went into the database. In their view, Tic Tac is the most important and the best documented case ever, and I agree with them.
And one of the most extraordinary reports that you have done is the one referring to Bob Lazar, the American ufologist and conspiracy theorist who claims to have worked in the military groups such as the S4 related to the famous Area 51. How does this experience change your life? And how did you get hooked with this story? Can you take us back to that time when you met Bob Lazar?
Well, I had met with John Lear, and we had done these interviews with him. And the third interview I did with him, at the end of that, he mentioned that he knew this guy who had been hired to work out near Area 51, and that he expected to get a lot more information about UFOs out in the desert, because Lear believed that we were reverse engineering alien craft out in the desert, which I found to be an outrageous story. That's just outrageous. But I said, well, I'm going to keep that in mind. I want to talk to this guy. It came to a day when we were hosting. I was the co-anchor of the 5 o'clock news, and we used to have an interview segment in each newscast, 5 minutes, and our guest bailed out at the last minute. I'm thinking, what can I do here to fill this hole? I called Lear. I said, hey, you mentioned about your friend who was a UFO guy out at Area 51. Would he be willing to do this interview? I had no idea what had been going on in Bob Lazar's life at that point because I'd never met him. And sure enough, he said, yeah. I had no idea that Lazar felt he was going to be killed. He was worried about his health, and he had been talking about coming to see me to do a story to save his life in order to get the story out there. So we did this interview with Bob. We blacked out his face. He used the name Dennis, which is a pseudonym, the name of his boss, and he told the story. There are 9 out at this area called S4, south of Groom Lake. There's a secret base built into the side of a mountain. And inside this base, a series of hangars. And in each one of these underground hangars is a flying saucer, an alien craft, as if we had the variety pack. They all look different. And he said, we're taking them apart to try to duplicate the technology. He said it's an antimatter reactor, that it was powered by something called Element 115, that it's the biggest secret in history. And he felt that somebody like him was not really qualified to even be working on it, that because of all the secrecy, we had made very little progress in trying to figure out the technology. So he came forward. Well, it hit the fan. Things went crazy.
Yeah.
My bosses go rushing in. Is that guy for real? And to tell you the truth, I didn't know. But we started working on it. My boss and I went up to meet Lazar the following weekend, and we put him through paces. We asked him every question we could, and he answered them as best he could. And we left that thinking, what if this is real? I mean, you know how risky something like this can be for journalists, for broadcasters. We thought, gosh, we'd never done something like this, but we thought, well, maybe we'll try. We'll do our job. We'll investigate him, and we'll look at the broader picture of UFOs in general, and then we'll make a series out of it. And I spent 8 months working on that. And of course, there were immediately questions about Bob that came up. He told me where he'd gone to school, and I contacted those universities, and both of them said they'd never heard of him before. I thought, uh-oh, this could be over really quickly. And then I went to Los Alamos National Lab. He said he had worked there at the lab, not for the lab. And I contacted the lab, and they said, no, we have no records of him ever being here. I thought, well, that's really funny, because I had a newspaper article from Los Alamos. On the front page, there's a picture of Bob in which it said he's a physicist. I also acquired the phone book from the lab. The lab says he was never there. His name is in the phone book for 1987, 88 period. So I knew somebody was lying. I started writing a series of letters to them back and forth. I wrote to the company that had hired Lazar. They had agreed to give me the letters and documents, and then they clammed up. It was clear to me that I was being jacked around. So as a journalist, you know how you would feel if somebody is lying to your face.
Yeah.
I was mad about it. I was angry about it. So that really sort of got me going and kept me interested. And I know that there are many questions that people have about Bob Lazar. I don't care. At this point, I don't care. It's been more than 30 years. I've answered every question I can. And as a journalist, I don't want to be out there campaigning and try to convince somebody it's true. I presented the case. Here's what we found. Here's the holes in it. Here's the stuff that supports Bob Lazar. And there's quite a bit of things that he knew that he could not have known otherwise, things that were real. There really is an S4 on the Nellis Range.
Exactly. And in the Jeremy Corbell documentary about Bob Lazar, there is an allusion that Bob still has an element 115. Does he really have an element 115?
Well, I can tell you that he did have it because I saw it. I was at his house. Wow. He had it it was a pewter sort of a device that he had created to sort of protect it from unwanted rays and things and particles. And it was in his house. He took it out one time and they did an experiment called a cloud chamber experiment in which they could show that this element 115 affected gravity. It bent light in essence. He thought it was real. His friends thought it was real. The government seems to have thought it was real because they came looking for it a bunch of times. They came looking a bunch of times. And, if I believe that Bob has put that away somewhere in a place where nobody's going to find it unless he wants to break it out. Yeah. I've tried to convince him that he should, but I think he probably sees that as his insurance policy that keeps him alive, because there have been threats both against him and against me and likely against Jeremy Corbell. Exactly. Back in those days, we now assume, Ari, that our phones are listened to, that everything goes into some giant supercomputer somewhere. All emails are recorded, that somebody's watching all of it. Mine were. I know that my phones were tapped back in those days, and we were followed. And I had people who had offered to give me information to back up Lazar's story about Area 51, S4, flying saucers. And one after another, people I talked to on the phone were visited and were told to shut up. They were threatened. One after another, 6 in a row. So I realized that somebody was listening to my phone without a warrant, without justification, and it really made me angry. It also suggested to me that this is serious in some way, that somebody somewhere takes this very seriously. So I understand that a lot of people don't believe Bob Lazar. I don't care. At this point, I've made the case. People can believe what they want.
And have you ever been inside Area 51 or S4?
No, they're never going to let me in there. I've been up to Area 51, the outskirts of it, probably 100 times, close to the 100 times. We used to go out there in those days after I had met Lazar. My photographer and I would go out and camp in the desert and have cameras and lenses looking at the sky to see whatever we could see. And I've been out there so many times since then. I was there for Storm Area 51, that big party a couple of years ago, but I've never seen anything that looked like a flying saucer, although I have a lot of videos and photos that other people have taken. I have been followed and chased and harassed, but still have never seen a flying saucer. And I don't think, considering the stories that we have done about Area 51 have drawn thousands of people from all over the world every day, even this many years later, there are people out there in the desert hassling with the guards, watching whatever secret projects are underway. So I know I have caused them a lot of trouble, and I would probably be the last person they'll ever let in there, ever.
Do you think they still do reverse engineering of extraterrestrial vehicles of Area 51? Or since the news broke out, the reverse engineering of UAPs was moved to different location?
I have to believe it was moved because it's not only did our stories focus so much public attention, the public in general, but congressional attention. There were congressional investigators who saw that. They didn't necessarily believe it, but they wanted to find out, is there a cover-up going on underway? Are they using legitimate national security funds to keep this cover-up going, siphoning it from another program? So they went out there looking. And I would think that would make the people who are out there very nervous to have that level of scrutiny. Also, every major news organization in the world beat a path to Area 51's door. There have been stories, BBC, ABC, NBC, CBS. I'm sure every network in South America, Latin America have done the same things. I mean, that's known all over the world. You can't go anywhere and not see people who know what Area 51 is because of those stories that we did so long ago. So I think that if, with all that attention, if they had it out there, and I believe they did, that they had to move it somewhere. There's a lot of desert in Nevada. There's a lot of other little bases, secret places they can stash it. I've heard reports that people think they took it to Utah. Some people think they took it to Allen Ocean bases or maybe to Australia. I don't know. I don't know where it went.
Yeah, and just recently, the United States Congress held the first hearing in more than 50 years on unidentified flying objects, meaning that the Pentagon official testified at a rare public hearing about unidentified phenomena, and landmass pledged to bring transparency to an investigation, unexplained reports by military photos and others. Why do you think the US government admit that it has evidence of UFOs?
I think it is again public pressure and media pressure. So in December of 2017, the New York Times breaks out this story about this secret program called ATIP, and how Harry Reid and Robert Bigelow got $22 million to fund it. The New York Times story was wrong. There was a program, but it wasn't ATIP. ATIP came later. There was a program called OSAP, and it was $22 million that funded a secret study overseen by the Defense Intelligence Agency. And they created the world's largest UFO database. And they also studied Skinwalker Ranch, and things got kind of weird. The US government got nervous about the program and the funding was pulled, and something called ATIP continued. That was Lou Elizondo continued ATIP, looking at military encounters, things like the Tic Tac and Gimbal cases, which were very significant. You know, it was seen as a significant potential threat to our military and our national security.
Yeah,
New York Times got the story. Lou Elizondo came forward. The Times did the story, and because of the New York Times and their stature and credibility, other media followed. And I'll tell you, a month later, in January 2018, members of Congress demanded closed-door briefings. They said, we want to know what's going on. Is this real? And they started calling in witnesses and hearing from the pilots. And once they realized there is evidence that this is really going on, that the US government has been investigating, they said, let's keep it going. They created the UAP task force. That presented its report last year, which said, hey, we got 144 cases and 143 of them are not explained. And they're serious. These things they're showing technology that we do not have and that we do not believe any government has. So, we need to investigate it. I never thought I would live to see this. I never thought that we'd get to this point where we're having open public hearings discussing this, where members of Congress are demanding to know more. I'm excited for what the future holds. It's just an amazing time right now for this subject. And after 35 plus years of banging my head on this, I'm astonished that my media colleagues are finally taking a dive into this and realize there's really something there. There's really something to it.
Wow. And with the recent government interest in UAPs is now do you think is the most exciting time in history of alien disclosure? How is it different now from before?
Well, the discussion is in the open, and military people who've been keeping these secrets for a long time are having to answer questions. However, I would temper everyone's expectations, because I think the closer we get to the secrets, the real secrets, the tougher they're going to get. My personal belief is that there is alien technology, not only metamaterials, bits and pieces from crashes, but intact craft, as Bob Lazar described. I think we have those things. And now other people who have knowledge about that have stepped forward and told Congress about it behind closed doors. Congress is starting to ask questions. Hey, where is this stuff? They want to know if there are private companies that have contracts with the government to handle it. I think the answer is yes. So it's really exciting that they're starting to ask those questions, but the closer they get to the goodies, I'll call them, the really good stuff, the crashes, the metamaterials, the craft, and the bodies, the tougher the keepers of those secrets are going to get in pushing back. We have a long way to go before we find out what they really know.
And some people say that they have been abducted by extraterrestrials. Have you ever seen someone being abducted? And why do you think aliens abduct humans? What is their intention? Have you find something about this abduction?
I've I've spoken to dozens of people who have told me their abduction stories. There are few of them, very few, who I think were just making it up for attention. Most of the people who've had these experiences don't want attention. They didn't want to tell me about it. They don't want to be on television. They're embarrassed. They're embarrassed to say that it ever happened to them. They're scared. A lot of them, it has severe, lifelong psychological consequences. I know when we started looking at abductees back in 1990, they struck me as being sincere and very frightened, and not out to cash in, to write a book, to become famous as a result. They just wanted to know what was going on. In those days, the typical abductee had some sexual experience. There was an interest in human reproduction. They would take samples of men and women. And there were a lot of people who had theories that the aliens were trying to produce some kind of a hybrid race or something like that, or improve the genetics of their own species. I don't know what that purpose is. In the last couple of years, it's changed. The attitude of abductees has softened toward these beings, whatever they are. And that a lot of people report positive experiences. After they're over the initial fright, they have positive experiences. It changes their attitudes about the earth, about preserving the planet, about the nature of interactions with other humans. It totally changes their personal philosophies. So a lot of them see this as positive. I don't know where these aliens are from. I'm not calling them extraterrestrials, although they could be. It seems like it's a non-human intelligence, but I think it's one that's lived here for a long time. I think they're interested in us because we affect them. What we do to the planet affects them as well. And I think that's what their long-term interest is. They've been around for a long time. We can only guess at what their agenda is because, people who interact with them say the aliens give them these editorials: take care of your planet, quit blowing up nuclear weapons, be kind to each other, save the oceans, that kind of stuff. All these editorials, but as far as we know, they don't really intervene in human affairs to help us out. So I don't know what their agenda is. I don't know where they're from. I don't know why they're here. No one that I know has any answers to any of the big questions. It's very frustrating, but also it's very exciting. I mean, it's very exciting.
Exactly. And do you think extraterrestrial are humans from the future?
Well, I have to keep that open. I've interviewed some experts on that. People have written books about it, and they make a compelling case that it could be us from the future. That maybe we're coming back to find out, to study when Earth went wrong, when we humans totally screwed things up and sent the planet off into a different direction. If they are us, if we look like that in the future, then clearly something happened to our planet, something catastrophic to change things. Time travel is a sci-fi concept that I think is a great idea for a novel and a movie, but I would never have believed it would be possible until recent times when some pretty advanced physicists have said it is possible to go back, maybe not to go forward. So I try to keep an open mind and not lock myself into any of these theories: ETs, time travelers, interdimensionals, whatever.
What are your thoughts on Phil Snyder's story? Do you think there was really a combat between human extraterrestrial at Dulce in New Mexico?
That's a tough one. I have some questions about it. I know that my colleagues who work with Bigelow have investigated the larger question about Dulce. They spent a lot of time. At the same time they were investigating Skinwalker Ranch, they started looking for other hotspots around the world to investigate, and Dulce was one of them. Right next to Dulce is the Jicarilla Apache tribe. So they worked, it took them a long time to gain the trust of the Jicarilla Apaches, and they started asking them about the stories of Dulce, the underground base. And the Apaches did not believe that there's a base there. However, they confirmed that a lot of the same kind of activity that was reported at Skinwalker, Bigfoot, UFOs, cattle mutilations, things of that sort, were happening at Dulce. So, that's where a lot of the lore about Dulce came from. So I think there really is a hotbed of activity there. I think it's related to the Native American presence. There are other hotspots that the NIDS team, team investigated in the 90s, Yakima, Washington, UFO hotspot, again, right next to the Yakima Nation, the Yakima Indian Reservation. There were places in Arizona, around Sedona, which also is a heavy Native American influence. It seems like wherever there's one of these real big hotspots, a mixture of UFOs and paranormal activity, spirituality, skinwalkers, there's also a Native American presence there. So Dulce, I think that there is some legitimacy to the overall story. As for an underground base where we battle aliens, I have seen no evidence that that is the case.
Well, and before we're talking about the government, for some reason, for many years, the government is known for hiding evidence about UFO, and sometimes they even label these people as crazy. Why do you think the government or other people try so hard to hide these kind of informations about aliens? You told me before that you yourself have experienced something similar about people trying to hide the information that you find out.
Well, for one thing, a lot of people who are involved in this topic are crazy. And I use that term just in a general sense. I don't mean to be derogatory, but there are people who are drawn to it who are not thinking clearly, I think. They are drawn to it for a variety of personal reasons. And the government has manipulated that, has been able to exploit that concept. This goes back to the early 1950s when the UFO exploded 75 years ago this year. The modern UFO era exploded. June 1947 is when Kenneth Arnold saw his flying saucers in Washington State. July 1947 is when the Roswell crash occurred. That is really when the whole thing kicked off. And our government, the US government, just coming out of World War II, we'd had this horrible period where tens of millions of people had died. Suddenly there's a new threat in the skies. These things are flying around. We now know from documents that were shared between different military agencies back then that they took it seriously. They realized these things are not ours. They're real. They're not fictitious. They're flying around. I think they probably did not want to alarm the public at that point. Hey, there's something flying in the skies that we can't control. So they lied and they dug themselves a hole. They painted themselves into a corner with the lies, and they've never been able to get out of it. It's probably started for very good reasons. And then one lie after another made it harder for them to ever tell the truth. I think there's legitimate national security concerns about UFOs. I mean, there are some very significant cases that I have personally investigated about UFOs interfering with nuclear weapons.
Wow.
In the 1970s, there was a series of these things in the US. On the US-Canadian border, there are a number of US military installations where you have nuclear missiles, nuclear bases. And the UFOs visited them one right after another. And they'd appear over the nuclear weapons storage area or over the ICBM silos, and planes would be scrambled, security would run around, and they could never catch them. In a couple of those instances, at Malmstrom Air Force Base, for example, the UFOs disabled the nuclear weapons. It was a clear demonstration of their abilities. Not to get too far off the subject, but the same thing happened in the former USSR in Russia. I went to Russia twice in the 1990s. I met with high-ranking military officials, government scientists who had never spoken to journalists, certainly not American journalists, ever before. And I was able to obtain files from their Ministry of Defense. They had had this huge UFO study, and they had an instance in the Ukraine where they had an ICBM base. These missiles are pointed at the United States. UFOs appeared over the base. They zipped around. There was a gigantic UFO. It split into pieces. Then it formed back again. It was zipping around. And after it had been there for about an hour and a half, the launch control panels for the nuclear missiles fired up. Something entered the codes to launch these missiles. The Russians are trying to pound these buttons, trying to stop it, and couldn't. And then, boom, the UFO goes away. The control panel goes back to normal. It was a demonstration that whoever these UFOs are, wherever they're from, that they had mastery over our weapons. Our most powerful weapons did not impress them. That same thing happened in the US. So our government knows it is a legitimate national security matter. The more recent cases, the Tic Tac case, it's flying over a nuclear-powered battle group, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier and all the support ships. They're flying around with impunity over those ships, which have the most advanced weapon systems and sensor systems in the world, and there's nothing we can do about it. The same thing happened in several years off the coast of Southern California and on the East Coast, where the US Navy has its largest base, Oceana. These pilots from 2014 on were seeing these things every single day. They wouldn't report it because they didn't want other people to think they're crazy, but they'd see them every day because they would fly out of the base right into the same training area over the ocean, and there these things were. And they'd sit there. They look kind of like, they're not like flying saucers, they look like balloons or blimps, but they'd sit there in high winds and never move and be there for days at a time. Those things really upset the military. There are also cases, the Russians, for example, told me they had 45 cases where their warplanes encountered UFOs and tried to chase them and tried to shoot them down. In 3 of those cases, the Russian warplanes went down, 2 of the pilots died. And after that happened, the military put out an order for the Russian military empire, don't shoot at UFOs. I think our government has done something similar. There are a myriad numbers of cases where there are legitimate national security concerns. And I think that's what our government uses as an excuse. I think that they, for one thing, they don't want to go to jail. They've lied to us so much that when it comes out, some of them will go to jail. And number 2, they're worried how we will react. The fact is, they don't know what the truth is. I don't think. I've been pretty far up the food chain talking to military people who've studied this, and I don't know anyone who really understands the full picture. We don't know where they're from, why they're here, what their interest is in us, and we don't know what their time frame is. I mean, they haven't attacked our cities. They haven't done Independence Day and wiped out New York City or Washington or Buenos Aires or whatever. But we don't know what their time frame is. Maybe to them, they've only been here for a week.
As you mentioned, there are plenty of different point of view about aliens. Some people think that aliens are evil, or other things they're good. How would you describe the presence of UFO on Earth? Do you have any idea why you think UFO are among us?
Well, my personal opinion is they live here. I think they've been here forever. I think they've been here as long as we have, probably longer. If you look back at American history, world history, these things have been seen on every continent, in every culture, throughout human history, throughout recorded history and prehistory. Paintings on walls, when humans lived in caves, they've always been here interacting with us. There are suggestions that they have influenced human genetics, our evolution. Maybe we're an experiment, maybe we're like an ant farm. Maybe we're an experiment that's gone wrong. Maybe they've tried to make us better to help them. There's 50 different scenarios you can come up with, and the fact is nobody really knows what the answers are. They haven't attacked us and wiped us out.
Do you know there's a way that humans can communicate with aliens?
A lot of people say they can, and you can get into a transcendental meditation state where you can communicate. I have not been able to do that myself. A lot of people say they interact with aliens on an ongoing basis. They can't always predict when that interaction will happen or when these things will show up. I'd like to believe we can communicate. The abductees, the contactees who've had a lifelong experience with them have reported some, I think, pretty credible accounts of ongoing communication with sometimes with the same beings over a long period of time. I don't put a lot of stock in people who, hey, give me $1,000 and we'll go out in the desert and I'll promise you can contact aliens. But I do find some credibility in those who are, they call them summoners, where they go out, they meditate, and they try to draw something in. I don't know if you've ever seen any of those videos, Ari, but some of those videos that happen when they put their minds to it, groups, are pretty compelling. I don't know how that works or exactly what it is they're seeing in the sky, but I'd like to believe that we can initiate communication. I also worry that we are so far beneath them. It would be like us having a conversation with cockroaches,
There's like a lot of questions that people ask about aliens. They're very curious about aliens. And in 2002, you did a well-known report on the Skinwalker Ranch, a site where multiple paranormal activities have been reported for decades. What findings did you find in this location? What happened at the Skinwalker Ranch?
I co-wrote a book called Hunt for the Skinwalker with Colin Kelleher. He was the head of the investigation for Robert Bigelow's organization, NIDS, the National Institute for Discovery Science. Bigelow funded this out of his own pocket. He bought the ranch, put these scientists on the property, put all kinds of cameras and things of that sort. They went there looking for UFOs. What they found was something completely different. It changed my view of the topic in general. I now believe it is way more complicated than aliens from other planets coming here to visit us because of the things that happened at the ranch. Yes, there were UFOs, there were craft, things that looked like the stealth fighter, things that looked like a sombrero that would fly into Skinwalker Ridge. But there are a lot of other things that would be more like paranormal or even poltergeists. The people who've lived there in and around that ranch and the other properties around it have reported these things for years privately. They didn't want to be known as being crazy people, but these things have been going on for a long time. And it is a mixture. It suggests that it's not just extraterrestrials, it's something way more complicated. So I mentioned before when we spoke about the family that lived there, the Shermans, we call them.
Yeah.
The Shermans was their name, and Gormans is the pseudonym we used in the book. And they reported poltergeist type activity, cattle mutilations, Bigfoot, crop circles, all of these different activities that we as investigators always believe were separate phenomena were all happening in one place. That suggested to me and to others that this was kind of a learning curve, that whatever the intelligence is there at that ranch was trying to tell us something, that the universe, the world, reality, all of those are far more complicated than we might imagine, that we need to pay attention to this, that these phenomena that we consider separate paranormal things are not paranormal at all. They're normal. We just haven't figured out how they work and how they all fit together. Some of the things that happened on that ranch are really scary. We wrote a second book. I wrote it with there was a second study. The Defense Intelligence Agency had a contract with Bigelow. They created an organization called BASS. The program spent the $22 million. And among the things that they did was study Skinwalker Ranch. And what they found was they sent these intelligence operatives, tough people who've been in combat, combat veterans, work for different agencies, different branches of the military, who went to the ranch to confront whatever it was that was there. And they all were scared witless. I mean, they were scared. They confronted it, not only because they saw it there at the ranch, but because it followed them home. They call it the hitchhiker effect. So it's almost like it attached themselves, whatever it is, it attached themselves and followed them home and spread to their families, almost like a virus. It was one of these agents, these operatives, who was an experienced Navy guy. He's there on the property with two other intelligence people in the middle of the night in the middle homestead at Skinwalker Ranch. And they see this big black hole in the middle of the sky. They're walking right towards it. The temperature around them drops like 30 degrees in a matter of seconds. And they froze. They froze. This thing communicated to them and told them, we're watching you. You're not welcome here. Now they've got guns. They're strapping. They're ready for trouble. They were frozen. They start backing up, and they all were psychologically affected by this experience. Then when they got home, it followed them there. One of these guys, there was a woman. There was a female woman. She's like you. She's like a female James Bond, a very tough operative. She saw a creature there, a creature that looked like it was a dinosaur. She goes home after having that experience. She walks in the door. Her fiance and roommate welcomes her home. At that moment, a wine bottle flies across the room from one side of the room and smashes on the wall on the other side of the house. And they started seeing orbs inside the house. They started seeing these shadowy figures like a faceless Bigfoot inside the house. They were scared to death. It went on for months to the point where the roommate, fiance, moved out. He's leaving. Same thing happened to this guy who lives in this intelligence agent who worked for the US Navy. It follows him home. Suddenly he has poltergeist things moving around inside of his house. His kids wake up. They see these orbs in their rooms flying at night. His wife is doing the dishes one day. She's looking out in the yard, and there's a wolf standing on two legs. Its paws folded like this, leaning on a tree, going like this. Like she's rubbing her eyes. Am I really seeing this? She didn't tell anyone about it. 2 days later, her kids are in the living room. They look out in the same spot. There's the wolf again, standing on the two legs again. They scream for mom. They go outside, and this thing takes off, running on two legs. Now, I'm a journalist. You expect me to be able to report that people see a wolf man in their house and be taken seriously? But the fact is they did. And it was one of dozens of things that happened to them. It's still happening now, 10 years later after that visit to the ranch. I don't know what the answer is to the ranch. We wrote a book called Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, which is a report on the study that was done for the Defense Intelligence Agency. And it is obviously, a lot of people will see it as preposterous, but it's real. It happened. These things were real.
Wow. And among all of the events related to extraterrestrial life that you have known about, what events do you consider to be the most important events in history, the ones that have had the greatest impact on the population?
Well, the ones that have happened that we don't know about, for example, the nuclear missile bases.
Exactly.
In addition to disabling nuclear weapons, and this intelligence, whatever it is, has an intense interest in our weapons. It can disable them when it wants to. It can fly circles around our most advanced warplanes. It can go where we don't want it to go, and it seems to know. It's like Santa Claus. It knows when we've been bad and good. It can figure out what we're doing before we know it ourselves. And the fact that this intelligence has that kind of authority, that it can mess with our heads. It can not only disable the missiles, but in the cases that I have personally investigated, in those cases where it appears over nuclear missile bases, there is also paranormal phenomena, creatures that are seen in and around the base by the security personnel, ghost type activity. I don't know that it's really is poltergeists that are behaving this way, but it happens at the same time the UFO activity is there, and somehow those two are related. I don't know what the answer is, but those kind of experiences where it's more than one phenomena associated with UFOs is very disturbing.
Wow.
And exciting too.
And former President Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, although they have not confirmed the existence of aliens or unidentified flying objects, have declared that something strange is definitely happening. And the US government has officially said that they still do not know what are these objects. How important were their statement of these people of such high hierarchy in the United States regarding to the investigation of life in other planets?
I think that's very important. You know, Jimmy Carter said he saw a UFO. He said, when I get elected, I'm going to show you the files. We're going to open it up. And then, of course, he didn't. Gerald Ford, who was the president before Carter, in 1966, his constituents in Michigan, when he was just a House member, saw UFOs. And the Blue Book came in and told them that wasn't UFOs, that was swamp gas. Gerald Ford was mad. So he initiated the very first public hearing in Congress about UFOs. Later, we had hoped that maybe he would shed some light and open up the files. He didn't. Bill Clinton and his wife Hillary Clinton have had a lifelong interest in the UFO topic. When he came into office, he had instructed his assistant, Webb Hubbell, an attorney, look, I want answers to two questions. What's the deal on UFOs and who killed John Kennedy? And Webb Hubbell went out to try to find that information and was stymied with both of them. They couldn't get to whatever files existed. Bill Clinton has said, look, I tried to find out, but I couldn't get beyond the block wall of the Pentagon. Ronald Reagan made statements in public 5 different times about the world would be united if we were faced by an alien threat. He talked to Mikhail Gorbachev about it, and Gorbachev agreed. Reagan saw UFOs twice. He was deeply interested, as was his wife. But again, even the president didn't have the power to get through all the secrecy and get to the bottom of it. I think it's encouraging that they've come forward and said they're interested, that it's not crazy necessarily, and that maybe this will help down the line. Barack Obama made fun of the UFO topic a couple of times while he's in office. Yeah. Now that he's out of office, now that these other intelligence people have come forward and said it's real, he's changed his tune. He's made statements that said, well, there really is something to it, and we need to get to the bottom of it and investigate, that's an about face for him. That's a positive development. I'm glad these presidents and people of their stature have made these kind of statements. There have been others throughout modern history who have said those kind of things. Winston Churchill, Harry Truman, pretty well-known people.
There's a huge list.
But still, as I said before, the keepers of the secrets, the ones who really have the stuff, who can really show this is physical evidence, they're not giving up those secrets easily. You know, it's gonna, yeah.
And George, you have won multiple awards for your work as a journalist, among which are 7 AP Mark Twain Awards, around 24 regional Emmys, the Edward Murrow National Award, and DuPont Award from Columbia University. In addition, your investigation for the Bob Lazar case was cited as the best individual achievement by a journalist by the United Press International in 1990. What do you think should be the main characteristic that a journalist must have to be successful as you have been throughout your career?
I guess perseverance. I am not the smartest guy in the world. I try to absorb as much as I can. You have to know so much in regard to the UFO topic. You have to learn about physics and engineering, political science, a lot of things that are way beyond my limited skill set. So you have to be able to persevere. You can't be disillusioned because of how crazy the topic is and how much derision we get. For the first 30 years of my pursuit of this topic, I was beaten to a pulp by my fellow journalists, just relentlessly. Now I have thick skin. I don't mind. Sometimes it gets to me, but it always bothered me that other journalists who had not worked on this at all, had never done an interview, never went out to the desert to look in the sky, they never read the documents, never filed a FOIA request, that they could make fun of this, dismiss it, make fun of people with UFO beanie hats and T-shirts and things of that sort, and beam me up, Scotty, and ET phone home, and all the jokes that they've used for all these years, but have never done the work. So I am encouraged by the fact that that has changed a little bit. That now, as opposed to the first 30 years that I did this, now in the last 3 or 4 years, other mainstream journalists are diving in. And I suspect, in a year or two, there'll be many people who win bigger awards and break bigger stories than I have broken because they have national organizations behind them. But I'm so glad to have been around long enough to see that change happen.
Exactly. And recently, the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, Ronald Moultrie, assured that his country's soldiers have encountered unidentified phenomena and that his department is collecting data to analyze them. What are the latest technology that helps to prove that aliens does exist?
Well, the Tic Tac case, for example, demonstrated a technology that we don't have, but it is one that we've been trying to develop for a long time, anti-gravity. Physicists now, because of that case, they've had to rethink what they know about how the universe works, how propulsion works. There are craft, Jeremy Corbell and I have presented some videos of craft behaving in ways we don't understand. I mean, these spheres that are floating along with the US military, they have no wings, no tail, no rudder, no known propulsion. They can fly along in high winds. They can enter the water, leave the water. We don't have that technology. That's not ours. We'd like to have it. And right now, I know that there is a crash course happening in our government, probably in your country as well, where they're trying to figure this stuff out. The first country to get that technology wins. The first humans who can build a Tic Tac, that's it. You only need one. It would have supremacy over all other military technology in the world. And that's really where the secrecy comes from. Our government, I think there are elements in our government that would like to tell the world about UFOs, but as has been said to me, you can't tell your friends without telling your enemies. We don't want the Chinese to know how far along we are. We don't want the Russians to know how far along we are. But there is a crash course going on right now in trying to duplicate the Tic Tac technology and figure out how these things fly.
Exactly.
That's really the ultimate reason why we have secrecy. That's why I'm not sure that we're ever going to get the full story from our government.
And at the end of last year, the Airborne Object Identification and Management Synchronization Group was created. What do you know about this unit? What is the goal of this new group?
Well, it's a goal that's similar to the UAP task force that came before it, ATIP that came before that, OSAP that came before that. These programs are trying to gather all the information they can from various military agencies, the Army, the Air Force, Space Force, the Navy, and pull all those files together. They're having difficulty in doing that. The Air Force, for example, we had this congressional hearing a couple of weeks ago in Washington, and the Navy was there, and they were talking about files they got from this agency and that agency, but nobody mentioned the Air Force. Where is the Air Force? The US Air Force patrols our skies. They're in charge of the security of our open skies. They're the ones with the planes all over the country that have the best sensors and the best information. Where are they in this debate? We've seen them not make a single statement. So I'm curious about whether or not AIM, which is a terrible name, AOIM MSG, a terrible name for a program. I think they'll probably rename that program once they hire a director. Hopefully put in something that we can all pronounce and remember. Hopefully they would have the authority from Congress to go where the information is, to track down and see, did the US government ever have this technology? If so, where did it go? And what do we have to do to get it back? Because we're never going to really convince everyone that this is true until you got your hands on the goods. You know, the goods. I believe they're out there. I believe they are out there. And I know people who've seen this stuff, but how we get it and how we prove that it exists, that's another matter.
Exactly. And since you first started, you also produced a documentary with Bob Lazar on the same subject. When you started till now, how do you think the perception of the UFO has changed?
Well, the biggest change is the extraterrestrial hypothesis. That was the dominant paradigm when I started. And it's Bob Lazar supported that. He said he read these briefing documents that said these craft were likely from planets around Zeta Reticuli, and that's where these beings had come from. He didn't know if it was real or not, but that's what he read in the documents. So that has been the belief that UFOs are extraterrestrials, that they're space aliens. I think that that's the biggest change, is we don't necessarily believe that's true anymore. The things that happened at Skinwalker Ranch that we wrote about in those books suggest that it's way more complicated than just extraterrestrials. There's a guy named Dr. Jacques Vallée that I think is the most important thinker on this topic ever. He's been to Latin America multiple times, been to the jungles of Brazil and Ecuador and Argentina, and has spoken to locals and natives and people out in the jungles and people in the cities, and has developed the hypothesis that if you have this technology and it can manipulate space and time, which that seems to be the case, then you could be from anywhere. You could be extraterrestrial and interdimensional. You could be time travelers. You could be something else that we haven't even figured out yet. Exactly. That's the biggest change, I think, is that A, people are taking it seriously and looking at exotic explanations like that. And B, we no longer think that extraterrestrials is the only possible alternative.
What do you predict it will happen with aliens in the future here on Earth?
You know, I don't know. I'd like to believe that we'll be, while I'm still on this planet, that we'd get them some answers. I never would have believed we'd have congressional hearings and get this far, and that major media would be interested. But I'm most encouraged by the reaction from the scientific community. They're the ones that got to solve this. You know, some of these mysteries seem to be outside the realm of science. I think science is going to have to expand its understanding of what science itself is to get some answers, because this is not a phenomena that can be studied in a lab. It does not lend itself to test tubes and things of that sort. You have to have an imagination. You have to think outside the box to figure this stuff out. That's happening right now because of those news stories, because Congress has taken an interest. You now have academics and prestigious universities who would never touch this topic. We wouldn't come near it because it's so poisonous. They would think it would discredit them and wreck their careers. Now they're rethinking it. That's the most exciting thing that's happened. I'm glad that people in my line of work, journalists, are now pursuing the government angle. Who's covering up what? But it's going to have to be the scientists, the deep thinkers, people way smarter than me, who are going to have to figure out what this stuff means and how we interact. It would be great that we can establish communication on an ongoing basis with this intelligence. I'm not holding my breath, but I hope it happens.